Hello there. Welcome to our webinar today. I'm Kirsi Aulin, and Liz Hill, my associate director, is here helping with our behind the scenes technical pieces. To start, I'd like you to open your chat box. We'll be using that today to have conversation back and forth. I'll be asking you to respond to questions as we go along. And hang on, I'm just adjusting something now. We will be recording the webinar, and just note that if you do ask questions or make comments in the chat, that your names are attached to that. We'll use some polls today as well. The polls do not capture your name. Okay. This presentation is mostly based on a book by Dr. Harriet Lerner, which is titled Why Won't You Apologize? With the subtitle of Healing Big Betrayals and Everyday Hurts. Dr. Lerner is a very well-respected psychologist and the author of many books on relationships, including The Dance of Anger, which is probably the most well-known. She helped train Brene Brown. Brene Brown is very famous right now, serves as a mentor for Brene. The reason this topic of apologies is relevant to the Ombuds Office is that we frequently assist people who are seeking an apology or who want to offer an apology. And so I want to run a poll for you right now, and it is, have you ever been in a situation where you wanted an apology and the other person would not apologize? So I'm seeing lots of yeses come in. All right, so you're in good company. That is certainly true for me as well. So yeah, we're really at 100% that we have all been in that role. So in the chat box, could you chat me an answer to this question? When you did not receive an apology, how did you feel? You were wanting an apology, you were expecting an apology, you did not get that. How did you feel? Very, very descriptive language. Angerous, like someone slapped me. Astonished, not heard. Disrespected, ignored, feelings not valid. Oh yeah, this is a big deal. Yeah, feeling less than to another person. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Apologies are a big deal. Okay, let's see. I'm going to get rid of this poll here. Apologies are very important. And they're really part of our lives as human beings because we all make mistakes. And here's what Dr. Lerner says about it. We will all need to apologize until our dying day, right? So when done right, apologies are very healing. But when absent or when done badly, an apology will compromise a relationship. So we're going to talk about why some people don't apologize, but before we can get there, we really need to talk a little bit more about apologies themselves. So what happens when we apologize? We often have fears about apologizing. An excellent exploration of this topic is a podcast, which is by Brene Brown, incidentally, where she interviews Harriet Lerner about this book that we're discussing today. So, when we apologize, we have to admit that we're not perfect people. We screwed up, and that's hard to do. But according to Dr. Lerner, when we apologize, when there's a real heartfelt apology, 3 gifts occur. All right. The first is a gift to the injured party. The injured party can say, I feel soothed and calmed. I can let go of my hurt. My emotional safety and my feelings are important to you. My reality is validated. This last piece is very important to so many people. When someone does not apologize, there often, is this feeling like, am I crazy? So when you apologize to an injured person, you're validating that reality that they've experienced. The second gift is much more surprising. It's a gift to ourselves. So when I apologize, when I can see myself objectively, I will grow in maturity, resilience, and happiness and be more respected. One of the fears we have about apologies is that if we apologize, we'll be less respected. And in Dr. Lerner's research, she finds that actually the opposite is true. We are more respected. And then the third gift is a gift to the relationship. It's a gift that says we can repair harm. Relationships can't function if we don't trust that we can heal the disconnection, because all of us mess up. All right. So the next piece I want to touch on is accepting apologies. We tend to accept apologies by negating it. So I'm going to show you what the recommended language is from both Dr. Lerner and Brene Brown, actually. Take a look at that. When someone apologizes to you, responding with, thank you for the apology. So think about that for a minute. I'd like you to respond to that in the chat box. What's your reaction to this? How does this strike you? Thank you for the apology. I appreciate it. Depends on tone. Sure. Yeah, is it really genuine? That you were heard? So I want to contrast what they're recommending with what most people do, and that is this. That's okay. It's no big deal. It's important that we let the apology stand and we don't try to do away with it or minimize it by saying, oh, that's okay. The second piece that they recommend is don't criticize the apology for not being good enough. In other words, someone apologizes and you respond with, well, you should have apologized before I mentioned it to you. Or, that's fine for that part, but there's this other piece that you did too. They recommend that you allow the apology to stand. And if there are other things that you need to talk about, other criticisms of the person apologizing, save it for another time. That's not part of this conversation. You could always go back to them and say, I really need to talk to you about this other thing too. Yeah, it is hard not to respond with, oh, that's okay. Brene Brown tells a really interesting story in that podcast, which she said that when she's raising her kids and saying that's okay or it's no big deal is not allowed in her house. And she's taught her kids to say this, thank you for the apology, I appreciate it. Or thank you for the apology, it means a lot. And what's very interesting, and it goes so against the grain of our mainstream culture, is that her kids give funny reactions to that. So thank you for sharing your reactions with me. All right, we're going to look next at the consequences of a bad apology. I am sure that we have all been the recipients of bad apologies. You can always point to, we can always point to politicians, for example, for people that give bad apologies. So the consequences of a bad apology are many. They are profound. But a bad apology deepens the original injury. It's worse than no apology. I mean, that's significant. So what are the consequences? Well, relationships suffer, of course. People cut themselves off from each other, especially around important events or when people feel anxious. Now that's true for sort of, funerals and marriages and the birth of children, but also I want to talk about this a little bit because, we are in a time right now that it's a significant time and many people are feeling anxious. We're collectively dealing with the terrible murders of innocent Black people in this country. If we offer a bad apology about that at this time, or even if it's not related to that topic, because of the heightened emotional state that everyone's in, a bad apology will have a greater significance. And then, number 3, a bad apology can result in permanent uncomfortable feeling with the other, even if you remain friends or cordial colleagues. So I'm wondering if you've had this happen. Oops, it is not responding. Hang on. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble with. Here we go. I'm going to launch this second poll, which is how many of you have received a bad apology from a colleague, and instead of helping, you end up with a permanent uncomfortable feeling? So this is something that we don't often really talk about. Apologies seem like such a simple, straightforward topic, but actually there's so much complexity here. Okay, I would, looks like 77% of you so far are saying yes. We've got a no, we've got a couple of not sures. But let's talk about that a little bit. What are some apologies? Oh, I'm sorry. Let's go back here. Some apologies are worse than the original offense. And, it's interesting to think about it that way, that the original offense may have been minor, but the way someone apologizes, oh my goodness, they are digging themselves deeper. So what I'd like for you to chat in the chat box is some examples of apologies that you've received that made the situation worse. Now, I don't want you to identify a person or department or anything, but just sort of the general gist of it. My favorite non-apology, for example, is, well, I'm sorry you feel that way. Oh, I'm sorry, but, yep, that's a good one too. Sorry was just a joke. Oh, yeah. The non-joke, that's a joke. Exactly. I'm sorry that you feel that way. Yes. Oh, grief can make a person do crazy things. Yeah, that still doesn't make him right, though. Yeah. Yeah, too bad you felt that way. I'm sorry this is a sensitive issue for you. So, when you get those kinds of apology, they're making you even more wrong to have those feelings. Sorry, you must have misunderstood. Yeah. These are all, great examples of bad apologies. So Harriet Lerner talks about the elements of a good apology. And what I'm going to do now is run through them. There are 9 elements, and I won't, because there's a lot of material to cover, I will stop to sort of talk with you about it once we go through all 9 elements and kind of see what you think, okay? Because I want you to hear all of them before we chat. So get your butts out of your apologies. Notice there's 1 T and not 2. But yeah, this was mentioned in the chat as well, that, when you say I'm sorry, but, whatever follows is going to be a criticism, an excuse, or a justification. Everything you say after the but negates what you said before. And so it cancels out your apology completely. So it's interesting to note that even if what you're saying is true, this is what happens. And so again, this is the time to save the additional comments for another time. This is not the time to offer additional criticism. And this is the most common apology mistake, by the way. So, just because people are doing this, doesn't mean they're bad people. So, if the person's being a jerk, you can tell them they're being a jerk, but save that for another conversation. Don't pretend that's an apology, or, that's your exceptions of an apology. Okay. When you're apologizing, keep focus on your actions and not the other person's response. So this is really addressing some of the bad apologies that people were chatting. It's not saying I'm sorry you feel that way, but really apologizing unequivocally for what you've done and said. Okay, not talking about the other person's behavior. Okay. A real apology includes an offer of restitution that fits the situation. So an easy example is if you break your colleague's mug at work, you buy them a new one. I think we take apologies really lightly in our culture, and we tend to skip over this restitution piece. But apologies don't mean much if there's no restitution attached. Okay, the next element. A true apology does not overdo. Let me talk about that a little bit. So I'll give you an example. I think that's the best way to do it. Someone forgets to give you credit when they share your PowerPoint, and you point it out to them. And when you say, I would have they interrupt you with, oh, I'm so sorry. I never should have done that. Oh, gosh, I feel so terrible. I'm a terrible human being. I don't deserve to be in this department. You must think I'm horrible. This is what we mean by that. You overdo it. There's some people that do this habitually. And it's honestly a way of silencing the person who's been injured. A true apology does not get caught up in who started it and who is more to blame. So again, staying away from, well, yeah, I overreacted, but you did that thing that ticks me off. No, you apologize just for your peace. After the apology, you do your best to avoid a repeat performance. So that is very, very important in apologies. If it's a real apology, you need to be serious about not doing it again. If you told an inappropriate joke and the person called you on it, apologizing and then committing, I will not do that again, and sticking with that. It's very important. Next up, a good apology should not serve to silence the other person. So, for an example, people that are quick to say, oh, sorry, they're not really acknowledging the depth of the hurt. And when you go on to try and process or talk about what happened, they're like, I said I'm sorry. Shut up already is really what they're trying to say. They're not really apologizing. Next, an apology should not be offered to make you feel better if it makes the other person feel worse. So, what I'm talking about is pursuing the injured party to apologize to them, when they made it clear they don't really want to have anything to do to you. It's kind of akin to stalking. I think that's pretty self-evident that you don't do that to people. And here's a tough one. A true apology does not ask the other party to do anything, not even forgive. This is an interesting one. I agree with this wholeheartedly, and I think we make this mistake a lot. Some people even use it as an apology. They'll say, please forgive me. That's not an apology. That's asking the injured party to do something for you. So that's the last of these 9 elements. So I know we went through them fast. I'm happy to scroll back to the previous slides. I'd like to hear in the chat, any comments or questions you have about these 9 elements. And, let's talk about that a little bit. I also want to point out that on our Ombuds Office website, we have a document, Elements of a Good Apology. Liz will post that shortly. And it comes from a former ombuds person at Columbia University, and it's a slightly different take. That's completely okay. What Harriet Lerner is doing in this material is really delving deeper into the relationship pieces and the interpersonal benefits and harm. Yeah. So there's a question. Is it okay to ask, is there anything I can do to make it right? Absolutely. Absolutely. So that goes back to, oops, it's going the wrong way. That goes back to restitution, trying to make it right. This including an offer of restitution. I gave a very simple example of breaking something and buying a new one, but sometimes the harm is more awkward than that or bigger than that. If someone feels betrayed, it's very difficult. Okay, so here's another comment. Should not serve to silence the other person. This is tough because it takes a lot of self-reflection in advance. What should you do if you realize that you're giving an apology to silence someone after you've already done it? So one of the beautiful things about human relationships is that we can always revisit a conversation. We can always go back. Basically, if you realize you have used an apology to silence someone, it's an occasion to go back and apologize for that and to recognize that, hey, I did this. Because when you apologize for having silenced the person with your apology, it's a way of really going back to validating their reality, validating that, yeah, what you felt me do right there, I did do it. I did do it. Yeah. Great questions. Any other comments or questions about the good apology? So while you think, I'm going to still give you some opportunity before we go on to our next section to, yeah, when both parties feel like the injured party. So this is a very interesting question. So I'm going to go to my next slide because it's a partial answer to this question. And that is, Harriet Lerner says, an apology is not the end, it is the beginning. It creates space for more conversation. So if you're one of two parties and you both feel like you're the injured party, and you can see, yeah, I did this thing, I did this piece of it, it's on you to apologize for the piece that you did. It's on the other person to apologize for the other piece, and it remains to be seen if they will do that. But one of the things that Harriet says, or Dr. Lerner says, is apologies are not an all or nothing thing. That's a myth I'm going to be talking about in a minute, but apologies are, human beings are more complex than that. We think of apologies at all or nothing, but it's really more like, I did this piece, and then the other person did another piece, and hopefully they're willing to own up to their piece. Okay. So let's look at some myths about apologies. Defensiveness is a sign of a bad person. Everyone must apologize. Forgiveness is necessary for healing. I'm curious if you believe these statements. I'm going to run a little poll so you can remain anonymous. And do you believe these statements? Defensiveness is a sign of a bad person. Everyone must apologize. Forgiveness is necessary for healing. If you believe any one of them. These are myths that are sort of commonly out there. We've got some not sures and, some yeses mostly. Of course, I'm already telling you they're myths. So, if you did believe them up until this point, we'll be challenging that. And so, this is the most controversial part of the webinar today. These are popular beliefs in our culture. And, through her research and clinical practice, Dr. Lerner believes that these are not true. These concepts may challenge what you've previously heard. Okay, so I'm sharing the results. It's kind of interesting split here between mostly yeses and not sures. All right. Okay. Take this down. All right, let's go to defensiveness. Here comes defensiveness. It is natural and we all do it. That is the truth, and it is the archenemy of listening. So when we are defensive, what we do is we automatically listen for what we don't agree with. And we won't even feel it. We won't even notice that we're doing it. So what can we do when we're defensive? We can decide or pledge or make the attempt to listen, to understand, not interrupting and not arguing. We can make sure that we're breathing well. We can save our legitimate points for another conversation. And we can ask questions about whatever we don't understand. And this is tricky because you have to mind your tone of voice. Can you give me a specific example of how I have done this to you? Or help me understand what you mean? Those are some great questions. And then find something you can agree with. If someone's talking to you about something you did, maybe you only agree with 3% of it. Apologize for that piece that you did. If you don't agree with anything they're saying, you can say something like, I appreciate you bringing this up, and I will really be thinking about it. And it tells them that you care about them and doesn't oblige you to agree with what they're saying. And you might even offer, I'll initiate the next conversation. Now I've thought about this for a minute, I'll come back and talk to you about it. And it's important to thank the critical person, the person who felt injured by you. And you might say something like, although it's been hard for me to listen, I want to thank you for bringing this up. And if there's something you completely disagree with, like someone wants you to take responsibility for something another person did, you can express your difference, and you can do it kindly, saying something like, this is one thing we see differently. It's very important to listen carefully because no apology has meaning if we haven't listened to the other party's pain. So one of the things that's a myth is that, the person doing the injuring is fully responsible for everything. So sometimes there's not an apology because the wounded person had made it too difficult to apologize. An apology and reconciliation is a dance between two people or between people, and we play a part in how that proceeds. So if we're blaming and shaming, it makes it very unlikely that the other party will offer an apology. And so here's just very quickly Harriet Lerner's 5 quick steps to help them hear you. So when you're the injured party and you're bringing something to the other person, avoid overwhelming them. Make your description of your hurt short. Move from blaming to assertive claiming. In other words, not saying you caused me to feel this way, you did this to me, but saying This is what I think, this is what I feel, this is what I believe. Focus on how you feel and not the other person's crime sheet. In other words, not listing a point by point laundry list of everything they've done to you, but saying, when you do these things, this is how I feel, the focus on how you feel. Do not ask for or demand an apology. This happens a lot. People demand apologies or ask for an apology. It's not useful. People don't like being told how they should think or feel. And if you've demanded an apology and you get one, it really doesn't mean as much. And number 5, we have no control over how the other person responds. So we need to make sure we stand on highest ground, whether the wrongdoer hears us or not. So our statement itself should be healing, not the response. If we need a response, if that's what we're looking for, we're not ready to confront them. We're not ready to open up the conversation. So this last piece is probably the toughest. The entrenched non-apologizer. Some people are just not going to apologize, never. You need a strong sense of self-worth in order to apologize. You can see from our discussion of apologies how complicated it is and how much thought is involved, and how it's not just about saying a word, it's about really being thoughtful and careful and really processing an apology. And what both Brene Brown and Harriet Lerner say is that you need a strong self-worth in order to apologize. Brene says it this way: people with a small sense of self-worth are not able to apologize because they collapse so quickly into shame. And then finally, very sadly, the people who do the most harm are the least able to apologize. If you're talking to somebody if you're speaking your truth to somebody who's done great harm to you, you have to do it for yourself. It's very unlikely that they will apologize to you. And what Harriet Lerner says is that this does not mean that the person doesn't care about you. It's a completely separate issue. I think that's very interesting. I would encourage you to read the book because she goes in so much more depth into all of these areas. And she also asserts that forgiveness is not always necessary, that you don't have to forgive to be healthy. Now, this is some controversial stuff. There's a whole industry of forgiveness experts out there who would take exception to this. But Harriet Lerner found in her research that we don't even have a common understanding of what forgiveness means. And that what most people want is to let go of hurt feelings and move on. And she says, forgiveness is not necessary to do that. You can be a healthy and whole person without forgiving. So this is a partial answer for Carrie. Like, apologizing is not all or nothing. We tend to think of apologizing like pregnancy. Either you are or you're not. But Harriet really says that you can apologize for a percentage. You could even name the percentage what you're apologizing for. And here's something that she says about forgiveness. People want to offer forgiveness in situations when they're up against someone who will never apologize, but they want that person to see the error of their ways first. And people come to the Ombuds office quite frequently hoping that we will be this third party who will pass judgment on the situation and declare that the non-apologizer is, in the wrong. And then the non-apologizer will have this epiphany. Well, they'll realize, oh my gosh, I harmed this person so much. And, and then they offer an apology. And what Harriet says is just not going to happen. That's not realistic. It is possible for us to move to health and healing, and she has a chapter on healing in her book, by having other people validate our point of view and our experiences. not necessarily the person who harmed us. You know, that can be a therapist, that can be good friends and family members. So I was aware that we were running out of time, and I've kind of ran through this quickly. If you are still able to chat with me, I would be very interested in hearing, you know, any comments or questions about this point. This is my last informational piece. So I'm wondering if you have any comments or questions about these myths about apologies and forgiveness. I want to, while I wait to see if anyone has something to say, yeah, people don't have to forgive you what you might have done maybe too much for them to do so. And forgiveness is their choice to do what they want to or not. Even if they want to, it might take time for the hurt to subside enough to do so. Yeah, exactly. Harriet Turns talks about sort of radical forgiveness. That's a spiritual practice in some religions. And she says, you know, that's fine if that's, you know, if that's your religion, and that's not necessarily to be a healthy person. In her book, I ran out of time to read it, but in the beginning of her chapter about forgiveness, and she titles it, "You Need to Forgive and Other Lies That Hurt You." She starts with a poem by Claudia Rankine, who is an African-American poet. And, you know, Claudia describes her experience of showing up to a therapist for the first appointment and the therapist screaming at her, not realizing she was there for an appointment, and how hurtful that is. There's no "I'm sorry" that's going to bridge the brokenness that occurs in that moment. And so it doesn't make, you know, Claudia Rankine a lesser person if she doesn't offer to forgive that therapist. There are many ways to healing. That's one of the points that that Harriet makes in her book. There are many ways to healing. In our culture, that's the wrong word. We put so much emphasis on forgiveness as if that's the only way. And she said, that's not the only way. There are many, many ways to find healing, and that people should be free to utilize any way that they can to find healing. Okay, you've all hung in there. I appreciate that. I'm well over my time. I will stay here if you want to chat with me, have any other questions or comments about this material. Personally, okay, there's another question. I'll go ahead and answer that in a minute. Personally, I found it really liberating to feel that, hey, I don't have to forgive someone that's caused me kind of irreparable harm in order to move on and be a good person. So suggestions for strategies of letting go of the hurt when dealing with a non-apologizer. First of all, you can seek people who can validate your experience. So whether it's friends or therapists who can see what you went through and say, yes, that's real. You experienced that. And then you can engage in a whole host of different practices, you know, that will help you heal the hurt and set it aside. Things like meditation, you know, finding ways to be generous with other people, putting your emphasis somewhere else, and really, you know, letting go, dropping the feeling of responsibility for that interaction. For example, you know, Harriet works a lot with couples, and in a divorce or in some when there's a big betrayal, for example, people want the person who hurt them to recognize what they did. But she says it becomes this fantasy that they reenact in their mind. And I've certainly talked to people who have a vividly mapped out fantasy of how this person is going to come to grips with what they did. And she said that only serves to tie you to the person emotionally. that fantasy that there will be some sort of grand reconciliation, well, they will ask for forgiveness, just links you to them further. And letting go of this notion that that day will come really helps to focus on your own healing and your own ability to move on. A lot of this kind of work, the healing work, really happens in therapy for so many people. It's a very, very good place to do that work. Some people do that through their religious experiences as well. I do want to mention that, that can be an incredibly helpful way to heal as well.
Kirsi, it looks like you had one more question come in from Eve. Curious about your thoughts on the common use of "I'm sorry" and how it's almost an impulse.
Yes. So I think what Harriet is challenging, what Dr. Lerner is challenging us to do is to think a little bit more carefully. She talks about, apologies and forgiveness, and she uses the word sparingly. If you think about how easily we say, "Oh, I'm sorry," and we expect that we're done. If you think of that as a starting point, if you think about that as a launching pad for reparations for the harm, of continued conversation and processing of the harm, it starts to look like a very different thing. Now, I'm not talking about you bump into someone in the grocery store and say, "I'm sorry." That, that's okay. That's fine. That's the level of apology that's necessary for bumping into someone. You don't need to have sort of this grand plan necessarily. But people will often use "I'm sorry" in a very simple way and not expecting this larger process when there's been some serious hurt. Okay, I see another question. Forgiveness needs to also not equate to forget. If somebody's done something awful, that may show that you can't trust them, you can forgive them, and remember not to trust them again. So Debbie, this is a very interesting point, because one of the reasons I picked up Dr. Lerner's book is this is exactly what I've heard my whole life. I come from the Christian tradition, and you can forgive, but you don't forget, you don't trust them. So personally, I have a very difficult time understanding what that means. What exactly, in terms of interpersonal relationships, does it mean when you hold back and say, "I will never trust you again," but you've forgiven them? Like, I don't see how that necessarily goes together. To me, that means, well, you don't fully forgive them. And reading Harriet's book, where she talks about, for example, couples that deal with infidelity, she talks about a particular couple, for example, and the woman, in a couple years after processing, comes to a place where she says, "I can forgive you 90%, but I'll never forgive you the last 10 because this thing that you did." And Harriet says that's okay. That's enough for the relationship to repair and for there to be love. One of the things that I think is troubling in our culture today is we oversimplify our feelings. So, for example, we can both love and hate people. Neither one of those feelings necessarily is something that is a permanent condition, right? You can love someone and hate them in the moment as well. And she actually uses that example in one of her books about mothering. Mothers can love their children and the children do something and they're like, oh, in that moment, they hate them. So one of the things that's really refreshing about Dr. Lerner's approach is that I feel like she gets down to the nitty-gritty. She doesn't ignore the complexities and the problems and the difficulties we have as human beings in navigating this whole ground of, causing harm to others, trying to repair the harm. How do we do that? She really, she's very much in the trenches, if you will. Great questions. Thank you so much for the questions I've been receiving, because this is exactly the very, complex, personal, and often very difficult ground on which relationships falter. Yeah. So I'm happy to answer more questions. I'll hang out here for a little bit. Feel free, feel free to go about your day. I can see that so many of you are still hanging in there. I appreciate that. Okay, another question. Curious how you can use it with your kids. I would say, first of all, don't say it's okay when your kids apologize, and don't heap onto your kids when they do apologize. It's really easy to do that. Your kid says, I'm sorry, and then you say, you should have known from the last time we talked, and and Susie, you should have apologized. Don't want to load it on. Let them enjoy and the reparation that occurs. I think relationships with children are complex. They're incredibly grounding and joyful and rewarding and difficult. And I would say, whether you are a supervisor of a unit or whether you are a parent, your example is absolutely critical. How you treat your children's apologies. How do you apologize to them? How serious are you about their hurt? Do you repair their hurt? Do you offer them forgiveness? Going back to the forgiveness piece. So Liz is signaling to you that we have another session next week. So if there aren't any further questions, I'm going to go ahead and sign off for this time. Thank you so much for participating.